For all of you old enough to remember, my unit was F Troop. You all remember F Troop? Everybody was thoroughly entertained when I wrote home and said that I had been assigned to F Troop. Well, what I found in my own studies about the Vietnam War is that the biggest single problem with understanding it is that you can never understand anything about the Vietnam War by reading about the Vietnam War, because we've got pretty much an orthodox narrative now, and any book you read, especially really acclaimed books like The Best and the Brightest and Bright and Shining Lie, and if you watch the recent Ken Burns 10-part program, you're going to hear the same basic story from all of these different books. And there's two prongs to this orthodox narrative. Number one was given to us, kind of articulated well by Clark Clifford. He was a top advisor to a lot of presidents and Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson, and he described the Vietnam War as not only tragic, but a cauldron in which good and able men of high integrity, acting out of solid and well-reasoned motives, went terribly wrong. We made an honest mistake. We felt what we were doing was necessary. It proved to be unsound. And when he says it proved to be unsound, he's talking about the second prong of the orthodox story, and that is that the war was unwinnable. Stanley Carnow says it was a political conflict in which hearts and minds of the people were at stake. And David Halberstam famously said, "This is a political war, one that cannot produce military answers." Now, you can drive trucks through the holes in this narrative, but in order to do so, you have to read about a lot more than Vietnam in order to have frames of reference and understand causation. Now, I guarantee you that absent having read my book, nobody in this room has ever heard most of what I'm going to tell you tonight. And many of you might not like a lot of what you hear, but I guarantee you everything I tell you is absolutely true. Every fact is accurate. Every quote is accurate. And what we're going to do, it's kind of a study in what they call elephants in the living room. They use that phrase in 12-step programs. And the elephants in the room are described as a very large issue of which everyone is acutely aware, but no one wants to talk about. Perhaps a sore spot, perhaps politically incorrect, or perhaps a political hot potato. It's something that nobody wants to touch with a 10-foot pole. George Orwell once described this as, to see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle. And we start with Korea. The Korean War probably provides the most crucial frame of reference for understanding Vietnam, because Vietnam and Korea at the time we went in were pretty much identical situations, and what differed was the way we chose to handle it. By the end of World War II, Korea, which had been colonized by the Japanese rather brutally for about 40 years, was in a post-colonial revolutionary situation, and indigenous communists, who were the most popular group, were effectively running the country, and they were prepared to take over the minute the Japanese were out. The point being that Korea would have become a non-aligned communist country of its own accord, just like Yugoslavia at the end of World War II. We stepped in, divided it with the Russians, and installed Syngman Rhee's regime in South Korea. Now, whatever you've been told or think, there was absolutely no democracy under Syngman Rhee. We weren't running a democratic government in that country, and we were not wanted there by the Korean people. General John Hodge, who commanded U.S. forces, occupation forces, put it this way: the word pro-American is being added to pro-Jap, national traitor, and collaborator. We eventually had a full-blown insurrection against the Rhee regime that went on for nearly 3 years, and by nothing other than force and violence, Rhee was able to put this down, but he killed nearly 100,000 of his own people before he was done. New York Times reporter Walter Sullivan described it as a cloud of terror probably unparalleled in all the world. Journalist, war correspondent A.T. Steele wrote, "Only American money, weapons, and technical assistance enabled the Republic of Korea to exist for more than a few hours." But by 1950, we had gotten control of the country through President Rhee, our surrogate, if you want to look at it that way, and the country was solid, it was stable, and it was viable. Absent an invasion, Korea was here to stay, the Republic of Korea. The North Koreans knew this, which left war as their only option. Now, Truman, most people are probably unaware of this, had no intention whatsoever of fighting for Korea. Truman, the Department of Defense, and the Department of State had all looked over the world and decided that Korea was of no strategic value whatsoever, and that using American forces there would be a waste. And the Soviets knew this primarily through espionage. Again, no matter what you've heard for all these years, no serious Cold War historian denies anymore that there was a massive penetration of this government by Soviet agents during the New Deal and during the Truman administration. And they gave the Soviets absolutely everything. Particularly damaging were the famous Cambridge spies from Britain, Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean. Donald McLean actually sat on our National Security Council, and he knew everything. And everything that was ever written by the National Security Council went to Joseph Stalin in real time. Importantly, we also had nuclear espionage. Truman was also warned about that repeatedly, and basically he did nothing. So by 1949, they had the bomb, which Stalin required before he would confront the United States. He saw what he had as a risk-free war, so he gave Kim Il-sung the go-ahead, and the war in Korea began. The one thing Stalin couldn't count on was American domestic politics. It's something that was completely beyond their grasp, and 1950 was an election year. And Clay Blair, in his book on the Korean War, put it this way: in the existing domestic political climate, the loss of South Korea to communism would have been politically catastrophic for Truman and the Democratic Party. Robert Mann, the author of Grand Illusion, agrees, and he says, and I quote, "Had Truman wavered or refused to assist South Korea in the critical days following the invasion, it would have effectively ended his presidency and spelled an end to Democratic control of Congress." This is what is known as governing by the permanent campaign. You have to govern the way you campaign, and your governing is a campaign. Bill Clinton distilled this once when he said, "Don't look past the next election, or you might not get past the next election." So we went to war in Korea based primarily on domestic politics, and we were operating under one rule only: don't lose South Korea. All other concerns were subordinate. Now, things went very badly from the start. Truman's Republic of Korea collapsed like a house of cards. Not only would the South Koreans not fight, they ran away, in the words of one American officer, like turpentined rats, beginning with the president and the senior military leadership. By 1951, they had left 10 divisions of equipment on the field, and in response, Truman initiated what was probably the most brutal military campaign, certainly of the 20th century, by the United States. By late August, we were dropping 800 tons of napalm a day on North Korea. The dams near Pyongyang, which provided water for 3/4 of the rice crop, were targeted and destroyed. Apparently, it wasn't enough for Harry Truman to kill their soldiers. We were going to starve the entire population. We dropped 130 more tons of ordnance than in all the Pacific in World War II. And our situation was kind of distilled rather nicely by Colonel Paul Freeman, who rode home from South Korea in the middle of the war, and he said this: "It seems so useless and stupid to liberate South Korea. We're destroying it and its people in the course of war more than we are the North Koreans. All Koreans hate us. Everyone here is an enemy. We can't trust anyone." Now, what's important to take from this is that nobody was winning hearts and minds in Korea. Nobody was being liberal. Nobody was pushing democracy. We were simply annihilating everyone who opposed us, and unfortunately, almost everyone in between. In September 1950, Zhou Enlai told the Indian ambassador to warn Truman, "If you go north of the 38th parallel, we will come into the war." This warning was transmitted to Eisenhower, or strike that, to Harry Truman, and just like the espionage warnings, he ignored it, and he sent MacArthur north. And once again, espionage would figure crucially in this. More than 40 years ago, if any of you have ever read William Manchester's American Caesar, he noted that, and I'm quoting him, "the enemy was being provided with MacArthur's battle plans." And they were provided with this throughout the Korean War, again by the Cambridge spies and everybody else. And on the night of November 25th, 1950, 300,000 Chinese hit MacArthur's very badly deployed forces because they knew where he was and they knew how to hit his forces. The commanding Chinese General Lin Pao wrote this in his own memoirs: I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation had I not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur from taking adequate retaliatory measures against my lines of supply and communication. Just imagine how World War II would have gone if Hitler had known everything and had been waiting on us at Normandy with 10 or 15 divisions of armor and mechanized infantry. That's the way the Korean War went from beginning to end, and that's why it was such a disaster for us. In the end, we ended up with stalemate in a wasteland. Dean Rusk said there was nothing left to bomb. We had catastrophic casualty levels. We had 3 to 4 million dead. We'd wiped out 20% of North Korea's pre-war population. So while South Korea was secure, the overwhelming majority of casualties were inflicted between September of 1950, after we had effectively secured South Korea, and June of 1953, during the period of time when Truman ordered MacArthur north. So, in fact, millions of people had died for absolutely nothing, for no gain whatsoever, and the American people were very, very unhappy with Harry Truman, and for good reason. Again, important to note is that there was no democracy, no reform, no liberalization. We hadn't won any hearts and minds. We simply destroyed anyone who opposed us. Most importantly for the political class and the people who would take us through Vietnam, Truman was run out of office with 22% poll ratings, and the Republicans took both houses of Congress. This is what mattered to the people who would run the Vietnam War. Regular people like us care about all the people who've died and all the treasure that's been lost. All they're concerned with are the poll numbers and how it affected them and their politics. And what we got out of Korea are what I call Ellsberg's rules. Daniel Ellsberg produced these in 1971 in a book called Papers on the War, and he recognized that Korea was a controlling factor in all of Vietnam, and this is the way he put it. Rule number 1 is, do not lose the rest of Vietnam to communist control before the next election. And you can actually put, instead of just Vietnam, you could put Laos, Cambodia, or any other country in there. But the rules do not end with Rule 1. There is also, ever since late 1950, when the Chinese communists entered Korea, Rule number 2, which asserts, among other things, do not commit U.S. ground troops to a land war in Asia either. Our actions, at least through 1969, would be driven entirely by these 2 rules, Ellsberg's rules. Now we turn to Vietnam. We had the same situation in 1945 as we had in Korea. It was a small Asian country. It had been colonized for decades by bad actors. It was a brutal colonization, and the communists were the largest and most popular group. They were prepared to take power, and left to its own devices, it would have become a communist country. The French fought them for 9 years before we stepped in, and we had the same situation as in Korea because the French had achieved dividing the country with non-communists in the south and the communists in the north. No Dinh Diem was the leader we installed. He was French educated. He was an ardent patriot. Ho Chi Minh thought very highly of Diem, and he wanted him to join the Viet Minh. He wouldn't, Diem wouldn't, because he wasn't a communist. He was sentenced to death, and he fled to the United States, where he made the acquaintance of some very powerful people like Francis Cardinal Spellman, Senator John Kennedy, and Mike Mansfield. So we installed him effectively the way we installed Diem. Now, just like in Korea, his position was very precarious. He had to contend first with the Binh Nguyen gangster organization. They were 40,000 strong. They pretty much controlled Saigon. They were backed by the French. They had no intention of submitting to his rule. He also had the Cao Dai and the Wahao. These were religious sects that had their own armies and controlled large swaths of territory. And in April of 1955, against our advice, he launched the South Vietnamese army against them, and it took him an entire month just to get control of Saigon, but he wiped out the Binh Nguyen gangsters. He didn't just make an accommodation with them, he wiped them out. He secured his capital. He was able to force the Cao Dai and the Wahao to make peace with him. He incorporated much of their armies into his armies. So he had effectively gained control of the cities. He then turned to the countryside, just as Rhee had in Korea. And he was very good and very efficient. By 1956, 90% of Viet Minh cells in the Mekong Delta had been smashed. According to Stanley Karnow, the Southern Communist movement was nearly extinguished, and as we found recounted in a captured document that was duly authenticated, Diem had, by 1960, truly and efficiently destroyed the Communist Party in South Vietnam. So he had certainly demonstrated his mettle as an ally of the United States, and the New York Times on July 7, 1959 praised it all as a 5-year miracle, not a plan, has been carried out. There is reason today to salute President Ngo Dinh Diem. As in Korea, South Vietnam was stable, it was functional, and absent an invasion, South Vietnam would still be here today. So we entered the 1960s supporting in South Vietnam just what we were supporting in a dozen different countries around the world. In Korea, in Greece, Taiwan, the Philippines, Guatemala, and Iran, we were supporting a reasonably stable, non-democratic regime that ran the country under our auspices for the primary purpose of keeping it out of communist hands. As in Korea, the communists knew this, so they formed the 559th Transportation Group and began work on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By the end of that year, 31 tons of supplies, 3,000 weapons, and 100,000 rounds of ammunition had been brought into South Vietnam, and tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops would follow. The important point here to remember is that this was an invasion. It was not an insurrection by the people of South Vietnam. Enter JFK. Now, he was an outspoken supporter of the Truman doctrine. He backed Diem. He backed his refusal to hold the elections required by the '54 Geneva Accords. And speaking in June of '56, Kennedy famously called Vietnam the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia, the keystone to the arch, the finger in the dike. The problem was, as near as I can tell from the record, he never actually believed any of this. He toured Southeast Asia in 1952, and he said, and I'm quoting him here, "I am frankly of the belief that no amount of American military assistance in Indochina can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere. The forces of nationalism are rewriting the geopolitical map of the world." But he called himself at one point the total politician, and as such, he was governed by Ellsberg's rules. He could not lose a country to communism. At the same time, he could not get into a land war in Asia. And he was confronted with this dilemma almost immediately. In February of 1961, communist forces in Laos inflicted a major defeat on our allies in Laos, and they were positioned at that point to take Vientiane, and shortly thereafter they could have marched on Saigon. In order to stop this, this would have required a major American military intervention, and Kennedy now was trapped. He, in 1949, you never hear about this, but he stood on the floor of the House railing at Harry Truman for losing China. We all know that a lot of Republicans did that, but nobody ever wants to talk about the fact that John Kennedy did that as well. He said there were pinks in the State Department, and that's why we lost China. Then he laid the loss of Cuba at Eisenhower's door in the 1960 campaign, and of course he called South Vietnam the keystone to the free world in Southeast Asia, the finger in the dike. So he found himself trapped in a box that he'd worked very hard to build for himself. Nobody made him take these positions, nobody made him make these declarations, and by and large he didn't believe it anyhow. So he went to his two senior military commanders, and MacArthur, surprisingly, given his anti-communism, told him to stay out. He told him not to go into Southeast Asia at all, it's not worth it, they'll absorb the whole army. This is what JFK actually believed was best. But this would violate Ellsberg's rule number one. He'd lose Indochina, so he couldn't do that. Eisenhower, on the other hand, told him to go in. He told him to go in with everything he had, and Laos without allies if necessary, and the appropriate scenario was offered in November '61. It was based on CETO Plan 5, and it would have required probably 250,000 troops to cut the DMZ all the way, run these troops all the way across to the Lao-Thai border, and then secure the western territorial border of South Vietnam. This, of course, would violate Ellsberg's rule number two. You would have to go before the Congress and announce to the world, I'm putting 300,000 men into Southeast Asia, and he wasn't going to do that either. So he rejected all of this and accepted a proposal to neutralize Laos, which was offered by Nikita Khrushchev. Now that ought to give you some idea how good an idea that was. They met in Geneva again, and this conference ended in July 1962 with an accord that required the withdrawal of all foreign military forces from Laos. That's why to this day historians write about the neutralization of Laos. 90% of these forces, by the way, were North Vietnamese communists. Had the 62 Geneva Accords been effectuated, the Vietnam War of history would never have occurred. But as Averell Harriman wrote years later, the North Vietnamese did not keep the Laos Agreement of 1962 for a single day. And what is really important to understand is that everybody knew what was happening. It wasn't being done surreptitiously. Roger Hilsman was Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs. And this is what he wrote at the time. It's a lengthy quote, it's a little tedious, but I really think you need to hear it in his words as a member of the Kennedy administration to understand what was happening. He said, "The communist North Vietnamese could easily put enough troops into Laos to take it over within 2 or 4 weeks if they were willing to take the risk of American intervention. But they were not willing to take that risk, mainly because the United States made sure that the risk was real. By using the more ambiguous guerrilla techniques that they were supplying to Vietnam, they could probably have taken over Laos in a longer time scale with even less risk. But they were unwilling to take even that risk over Laos, apparently because they felt the main area was Vietnam. For this very reason, however, the communists wanted to keep using the infiltration routes through Laos into South Vietnam. Until the matter of Vietnam was settled, the communists would keep some token representation in Savannah's government in Vientiane and thus avoid scuttling the Geneva agreements openly and irrevocably. But if the communists won in Vietnam, they seemed to be saying, then they would regard Laos as part of the prize." So what you're being told here by him is that Laos has fallen to the communists, and we know it. We can't take it back, but we're all going to keep it a secret. And if you doubt this because only one person says it, Maxwell Taylor, General Maxwell Taylor, ex-chairman of the Joint Chiefs and JFK Special Military Advisor, said the same thing, and I'll quote him as well. "The Geneva Accords did not result in the withdrawal of the North Vietnamese troops supporting the Pathet Lao or the cessation of the use of the Ho Chi Minh trails to supply the war in South Vietnam. It's all about South Vietnam. The dividing line between communist-held territory and that under government or neutralist control did not change in any important way from 1962 for the next 7 years. There seemed to be a tacit understanding on both sides that the fate of Laos would be resolved in South Vietnam. For that reason, the Pathet Lao took as a primary objective the protection of the supply lines and the Laotian panhandle, and they maintained a de facto partition of the country on a north-south line which prevented any effective military action from the Mekong Valley against their communications." That is a slide that gives you the strategic paradigm within which that war would be fought from beginning to end. And what you have here is the communists in control of not only most of South Vietnam's border, but all of the crucial terrain. So what this has done, again, they've accepted a de facto fall of Laos. This neutralization is a lie, and everyone knows it. And certainly the American people were being conned, because you can still read historians talking about the neutralization of Laos, and it never occurred. And this would prove disastrous based on the basic 10-to-1 rule of military planning. Conventional forces, when they're defending or when they're attacking, require generally a 3-to-1 advantage in troops to overcome defenders if all other aspects are equal. On the other hand, conventional forces, military planners will tell you, require a 10-to-1 advantage over guerrillas. This means that 300,000 American troops who could have been deployed to secure South Vietnam's territorial border and cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail could now be permanently stalemated and bled continuously by as few as 30,000 North Vietnamese. And that number would come down the trail every few months. This was a titanic shift in the balance of power that was accepted with a stroke of a pen in Geneva. So the deal is, with a wink and a nod, you guys can have Laos as long as you promise not to tell anyone about it, and we'll let you do effectively what you want and host a guerrilla war in the main arena, which is South Vietnam. In a nutshell, the communists would get their very best shot at South Vietnam, so that Kennedy, who needed the appearance of containment without a land war in Asia, would get his best shot at the '64 election. The people of Southeast Asia and the rest of us would get a nasty, bloody guerrilla war that we would not be able to win before the clock ran out. Now, this is one of these elephants in the living room, as they call it, that can be found in all the records in the history books, but nobody ever says it this way. Nobody ever looks at it this way. And the fact is, what you have to understand is that we agreed to this. This is what would cost us the war. An ROTC cadet can look at that map and understand why you're not going to win if there are guerrillas coming in and you don't have at least a 10-to-1 troop advantage. And the thing you have to remember is that we agreed to this. It wasn't forced on us. And when I say me or we, I don't mean us, I mean our government. By October of 1962, the North Vietnamese were now fielding large military units and engaging in large-scale attacks. So at this point, Diem asked for U.S. combat troops. And again, take note, this is an invasion. It's not an insurrection. Now, Kennedy and his best and brightest were completely unwilling to recognize or acknowledge this as a war. And once again, I'm quoting Roger Hilsman. He says they were determined to treat the problem of Vietnam as something other than a war. So they kept telling themselves, quoting Hilsman again, that Vietnam was a political problem of winning the allegiance of the people rather than a military problem of killing Viet Cong. This gave us the doctrine of counterinsurgency. And the doctrine of counterinsurgency is as harebrained and ridiculous as anything anyone has ever come up with. Think about it. We've been at it for 15 years now in Afghanistan, and how well is it working out for us? Now, counterinsurgency stemmed primarily at this time from the British experience in Malaya, where Commonwealth forces defeated a communist insurgency over about a 12-year period. The problem was that it was unique to that situation. The Malay Peninsula shares no border with a communist country for resupply and replenishment of troops. They had a genuine insurgency that received no outside support. Secondly, communist forces in Malaya, almost entirely ethnic Chinese, never numbered more than 8,000 to 12,000. The British were able to muster as many as 250,000 troops against them, which gave them, at any time during that war, between a 20-to-1 and a 35-to-1 troop ratio. The people subject to communist exploitation were almost all Chinese squatters who worked in mines and plantations, so they had no ties to the land. They were able to offer them land and new villages and resettle them. And keep in mind, even at that, it took 12 years to quell this little tiny insurgency. In contrast, South Vietnam shares several hundred miles of border with countries under communist control for limitless resupply and the entry of communist forces. The North Vietnamese were Vietnamese citizens who could claim the mantle of Vietnamese nationalism. They were loyal to Hanoi and no more subject to resettlement by the South Vietnamese government than American troops in Europe were subject to resettlement by Nazi Germany. And most importantly, they came in enormous numbers. Between 1960 and 1975, between 800,000 and 1 million North Vietnamese would come down the trail to assume the role of guerrilla fighters once they entered Vietnam. We never had anything even remotely approaching the military forces to counter guerrillas in those numbers. So the entire Malayan paradigm was just ridiculous, and yet JFK demanded it. This is what I need, so this is what you're going to give me. General George Decker was Army Chief of Staff. Lyman Lemnitzer was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. They told him flat out that it cannot be done. He fired them. That's what happens when you tell the boss what he doesn't want to hear. By the end of 1963, 40,000 NVA troops had entered. They would require typically 400,000 conventional forces to counter them. We had 16,000 in country. In 1959, the invading North Vietnamese were assassinated some 1,200 South Vietnamese government employees. And I'm talking teachers, cops, firemen, tax collectors, you name it, they killed them. 1961, they killed 4,000. That's 11 per day, every single day. We created a revolutionary development program to send 9-man teams trained in social services to win hearts and minds. And in one 7-month period, more than 3,000 were kidnapped and murdered. The North Vietnamese army was demolishing South Vietnamese society. We didn't have a hope of getting control of anything. From 60 to 75, 60 to 70,000 South Vietnamese civilians would be assassinated by the communists. So what we have here is South Vietnamese society, as we're trying to build it, is being torn to pieces by an army that we agreed to let into the country to do exactly what they were doing. Enter the press corps. Halberstam, Sheehan, Brown, Karnow. These are the guys who are famously feted as the heroes of this whole era for getting us the truth. And the fact was, they were 20-something ignoramuses who knew nothing about what they were doing. They could see all the problems in South Vietnam, but they had no idea why they were actually happening. And one of the reasons was, let's see, this gentleman right here. His name is Pham Xuan An. He was the dean of the South Vietnamese Press Corps. He worked for Reuters, the New York Herald Tribune, the Christian Science Monitor, and Time. And during his entire career, he was a North Vietnamese colonel, controlling the flow of information. Here is a picture of him in his brigadier general's uniform with Vo Nguyen Giap at the end of the war. He worked on a daily basis with Halberstam, Sheehan, Malcolm Brown, all these famous members of the Saigon Press Corps, Stanley Karnow. And this is a quote from Stanley Karnow. He's talking about An, and he says, "We would huddle together in the Brodard or the Givral, his favorite cafes, as he chain-smoked and he deciphered the puzzles of Vietnam for me." Now, what do you think An was telling him about what was going on in Vietnam? Do you think An was telling Stanley Karnow, well, your government has stupidly agreed to invite our army in to demolish your ally and left all of this territory under our control? That's why you can't get control of anything? Of course not. An helped create a parallel universe for these people because they worked not only with him, but he was the head of an intelligence network, and he told these reporters where they could go to get information. So they're going to other people who are working for him. And all the information they're gathering, or a lot of it, is being provided for them, to them by communist agents who want nothing more than the destruction of the South Vietnamese government. So they basically create a parallel universe in which Diem and his brother are the cause of all our problems. This is what we call today fake news. And it was the greatest disinformation campaign in history. The press corps also befriended a lot of US and Vietnamese officers who were also providing them all these leaks, all this inside information. The Vietnamese officers, nobody knows how many of them were actually communist agents. We found since the end of the war, all kinds of them were. And then we had the famous John Paul Van. Now, he was quite a character himself, and he was busily trying to repair his own career, which was fatally flawed from some of his own problems. And he decided to enlist the aid of the press corps in getting his version of events out, which was wrong. And this is John Paul Van speaking to David Halberstam. And he says, "I may be a commissioned officer in the United States Army who's sworn to safeguard classified information, but I'm also an American citizen with a duty to my country. Now listen carefully." And he would provide this information to these reporters, and lo and behold, it would all end up with An, all right? An was described as the reporter's favorite, and he went everywhere with him. They all shared all their information. And Thomas A. Bass, in his biography of An, wrote as follows: "An's writing was so lively and detailed that General Giap and Ho Chi Minh are said to have rubbed their hands with glee on getting his reports. 'We are now in the United States War Room,' they exclaimed, according to members of the Vietnamese Politburo." So we've got a bunch of smart officers who are providing, just like in Korea, they're getting all this information to run their guerrilla war. They know where we're weak, they know where we're strong, they know where there are good officers and bad officers, and we're feeding them this through the press corps. This is another one of these elephants in the room. It's in all the books, but nobody ever talks about it. You watch Ken Burns' 10-part program, and he doesn't say a single thing about this communist agent in the middle of the press corps working to facilitate the fall of the Saigon government. And Sheehan and Halberstam, by February of '63, were determined cold warriors who believed that the GVN, the government of Vietnam, was responsible for our losing the war. And they actually said, there's a very good book called Once Upon a Distant War. The author just died, and he says in no uncertain terms, they were determined to rid us of Diem, and that's the way they began to report their stories. Kennedy, interestingly enough, John Kennedy knew it. He recognized it, and he's famously quoted as saying that David Halberstam was wholly unobjective, actually running a political campaign. "It is essential," he said, "that we not permit Halberstam to unduly influence our actions. He actually knew what was going on, and that is what was happening. Nevertheless, Kennedy, keep in mind, never thought we belonged in Vietnam, and he would never have been there but for Ellsberg's rules. And these are all quotes regarding what he was doing, if you really want to understand the mind of John Kennedy. Those people hate us, he said. They are going to throw our asses out of there at almost any point. We don't have a prayer of staying in Vietnam, he said in April of 1963. We don't have a prayer of prevailing there, but I can't give up a piece of territory like that to the communists and get the American people to reelect me. In the spring of '63, he told Mike Mansfield that the only reason he kept us in Vietnam was his stake in the '64 election. He said, I can't pull out until 1965, until after I'm reelected. Now, this is another one of our elephants. This has been in all the historical records for 40 or 50 years, and what this really amounts to is a gross misappropriation of the foreign policy, the armed forces, the treasure and blood of this country for a non-public purpose. We put people in jail for this all the time. We do it right here, we do it in Chicago. A few years back, you might remember there was a gentleman named Robert Sorich. He was hiring for the city of Chicago, and he was running a scheme whereby the only people he'd hire were Democratic Party loyalists. He got caught, he was prosecuted, he was sentenced to 46 months in jail. Now, why is he a criminal and somebody like John Kennedy sending ultimately 16,000 men into a war just so that he gets reelected is not a criminal? How is one a misappropriation and another is not? The first time I ever read of the defense being offered of John Kennedy saying, well, he was going to get out after 65, I was probably 22 years old, and it occurred to me then, this is criminal. You can't do this. And yet it fascinates me because I find it virtually impossible. You read this nowhere in the literature, and I find it impossible to make people understand this. They think I've grown two heads when I try to make clear that it's criminal. And when I think of a president getting away with it and the little guy getting nicked for it, I think of that story from antiquity. I'll read this to you. This is Alexander the Great and the Pirate. The story is that Alexander the Great had captured a pirate, or his forces did, and they brought him to the emperor, and it went like this. Alexander asked him, what could possibly give you the right to sail the seas, taking by force things that do not belong to you? And the pirate answered, O emperor, what could possibly give you the right to travel the whole world, taking by force things that don't belong to you? What gave you the right to occupy the land of Egypt? Who made you king of Persia? By what authority did you invade the land of India? Because I use my own boat, I'm called a pirate. You, however, use your army and navy, so you're proclaimed an emperor. If you ask me who is the greater criminal, I cannot say. I do know, however, that if I had such weapons at my disposal, I'd be an emperor too. And that seems to be the only difference between people like Robert Sorich and people like John Kennedy. If he had the power and discretion to send 15,000 troops into a war, Robert Sorich would be an honored ex-president instead of a disgraced ex-con. And nobody will discuss this. You don't see it in any of the books, and I find it utterly fascinating. And I think that anyone who's going to defend what Kennedy was doing had better be willing to tell me I would send my own children into that war to keep the incumbent in office. If you're not going to send your own, don't tell me that you're going to send anybody else's. Now, finally, our last elephant in JFK's living room is the scuttling of the only real peace talks that were ever occurring. In May 1963, Ziem's brother Neal called for a major reduction in U.S. forces because they'd had enough, and they said that this is fueling communist propaganda. The Kennedy State Department went crazy, and Ziem was warned in no uncertain terms, you better knock that off. Don't you ever call for us to pull out. In August, General Nguyen Khan informed CIA Station Chief John Richardson that Neal was seeking a compromise with Hanoi. Mstislav Manelli was a Polish member of the ICC, and he was involved in this. And interestingly, again, this is why this is an elephant in the living room. He outlines this in an essay published in the New York Times, January 27, 1975. And again, I'll quote him. I was secretly asked by President Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother to approach the government in Hanoi in order to explore the possibilities for a peaceful resolution of the struggle. During the subsequent months, I had many wide-ranging discussions with the highest North Vietnamese officials, including President Ho Chi Minh and Premier Pham Van Dong. The North Vietnamese leaders were slowly developing plans, which I discussed with a group of Western ambassadors. They were willing to accept a negotiated agreement whose result would not have been worse for the West than the one of 1973. Vietnam would have been divided into two parts with free commercial and cultural communication between them. Hanoi's only unshakable demand was that we get out. Well, the Kennedy administration became aware of this on 8/31/63. They'd been aware of it previously, but Ambassador Lodge cabled JFK and told him flat out Diem and his brother Neal wanted us out. Now, it's ironic that Kennedy had said in early '63 the best way to facilitate his intentions was to put in a government that would ask us to leave. And that's just what he had. But Ellsberg's rules were still the only thing that mattered. So the Kennedy administration went ahead and sent a cable to Saigon's generals and told them, if you expect us to continue supporting you, you're going to have to get rid of Diem. And they knew exactly why they were doing it. Bobby Kennedy said, if the coup fails, Diem will throw us out. John Kennedy agreed and said, failure of the coup could in one blow defeat our whole effort in Vietnam. If we miscalculated, we could lose our entire position in Southeast Asia overnight. And why were we maintaining that position to begin with? Because I cannot give up a piece of territory like that to the communists and get the American people to reelect me. That's the only reason it was going on. So finding out that the government of Saigon was going to end the war, the coup took place on November 2nd, and it ended with an Allied head of state overthrown and then shot and stabbed, murdered in the back of an APC after being promised safe conduct. Now, it's all pretty disgusting, and yet reading American press reports, one would never imagine that it was disgusting. The New York Times called it highly desirable, and the Washington Post ran an editorial entitled, Hope in Saigon. What's interestingly is to read what the Vietnamese communists said. When told that we had had Diem assassinated, Ho Chi Minh was nothing less than amazed and said, I can scarcely believe that the Americans would be so stupid. The Politburo in Hanoi agreed. Wilfred Burchett, who was a pro-communist Australian journalist, had a lot of contacts in Hanoi, and he visited with them regularly. And he reported that the leaders in North Vietnam considered Diem's overthrow a gift, telling him, and I'm quoting them, the Americans have done something that we haven't been able to do for 9 years, and that was get rid of Diem. Always happy to see an American setback, Burchett himself was very pleased, and he said, we never believed the Americans would let Diem go, much less aid and abet his departure. Diem was a national leader, and you will never replace him. Never. And history obviously proved them right. Now, this is a point where you have to stop and ask yourself, our young 20-something know-it-alls of the press corps deliberately set out to get rid of this man because they thought he was inept and corrupt and costing us our commitment in Southeast Asia. Who do you think was a better judge of Diem's value as a leader and an ally? Ho Chi Minh or Neal Sheehan or David Halberstam? I think the answer to that question is pretty obvious. And you also have to ask yourself, using Korea as a frame of reference, how long do you think Syngman Rhee would have lasted from 1946 to 1950 if we dealt with him the way we dealt with South Vietnam, if we gave North Korea control of the border, toward the North Koreans, you can come in any numbers you want and do whatever you want, and by the way, we'll do nothing but yell at Syngman Rhee because he's not running a democracy. How long do you think South Korea would have lasted? The simple fact is that no third world leader on America's side of the Cold War could have ever survived this. And if there was a corrupt, incompetent government preventing enforcement of the Truman Doctrine in Southeast Asia, it was Kennedy's. It was not Diem's. And what's ironic is that, for example, we have this Profile and Courage Award named after John Kennedy, and it's dedicated to politicians who do what is right rather than what is expedient. And yet history shows us that every single thing JFK did was what was expedient. It was never what he thought was right. And every single thing he did during his 1,000 days in office escalated and deepened a commitment that would have ended if he had just left well enough alone. So I don't know if you see any good and able men of high integrity here, but I don't. Enter LBJ. Like Kennedy before him, Johnson constructed his policy around Republicans in Washington, not communists in Asia. He feared, quote, another Korea, and feared major escalation since, quote, a Korean operation might alarm the electorate. He said, we do not want another China in Vietnam, but neither do we want another Korea. Like Kennedy before him, he revealed in private just how little he believed it was worth. He said, I don't see what we can ever hope to get out of there with once we're committed. I believe that the Chinese communists are coming into it. I don't think we can fight them 10,000 miles away from home. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. It's just the biggest damn mess I ever saw. And why can't he get out? Ellsberg's rules and Republicans in Washington. He says the Republicans are going to make a political issue out of it. Every one of them, even Dirksen. And I don't know how the hell you're going to get out unless the Republicans tell you to get out. Now, how do you like that? We elect Johnson as the peace candidate, and he's so useless and so afraid of the Republicans that he basically says, I'll go to war now because if I don't go to war, the Republicans will pick on me. That is a spectacularly dysfunctional democracy. From 1965 to 67, 200,000 more North Vietnamese troops entered under the 1962 tacit agreement to host a guerrilla war in South Vietnam. And Tet of 68 is an important point for a couple of reasons. Tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops launched attacks across the cities and towns, and most importantly, the South Vietnamese people did not rise up against their government. They all stood with the government. The South Vietnamese armed forces were not routed. They stepped up and they fought rather well. At the same time of the communists, they lost an entire generation of resistance fighters, anywhere from 50 to 60,000, depending on whose figures you read. It was really, for a lot of purposes, a very important American victory, and it was, of course, again, an invasion, not an insurrection. So how was the Tet turned into the defeat? Well, we have to look at Pham Xuan An. He was the middle of the Saigon Press Corps. He affected everyone. He explained to the reporters exactly what it all meant. He chose targets to be attacked in Saigon and coordinated the attacks. But most importantly, he then made sure the press knew how to report it. They all relied on him. Once again, it's fake news, and you don't hear anything about this. You watch Ken Burns' 10-part program, and he doesn't talk about this. And I don't know how you can purport to tell people about the Vietnam War and not discuss the Laotian Accords, the agreement to host a guerrilla war, or the effect of Pham Xuan An, but they simply don't talk about it. Richard Nixon comes in. Now, he's got a slightly different mandate. He's not so much bound by Ellsberg's rule anymore because everybody knows there's a land war in Asia. His mandate is from a housewife who was quoted by Stanley Carno in his book. He needs to get out without giving up. So he proposes a mutual withdrawal of U.S. and North Vietnamese forces. We would continue to support the GVN, and we would Vietnamize, if you will. We would draw down as the Vietnamese forces stepped up. The North Vietnamese began these talks with two unshakable demands. One, an unconditional withdrawal of all American forces. Understand that, unconditional. You are going to leave as the very first thing. Secondly, they wanted us to replace the GVN with the government acceptable to Hanoi. Then, and only then, understand that, once we pull out and put a communist government in Saigon, then they said, we'll be willing to discuss the fate of several hundred American prisoners, for whom, by the way, they intended to extort a huge ransom. They were not going to give those men back. Now, with the sides that far apart and the communists making demands like that, nobody was ever going to negotiate a peace, and they knew it, all right? No electable American president was going to pull out, put a communist government in Hanoi, and then go to Congress and the American people and say, oh, by the way, I need $10 billion to buy our prisoners back. Nobody was going to do that. And I don't even think George McGovern would have done that. But what they really wanted, the communists, they had been so badly mauled in Tet, what they needed now was time to rebuild their forces in South Vietnam, and the peace talks would give them time. Remember what I said, the clock is running. They know the clock is running, and we can't stay there forever. Ho Chi Minh put it nicely when he once said, you will kill 10 of my men for every one of yours I kill, and even at that rate, it is you who will tire of it. C.L. Sulzberger wrote a cogent analysis in the New York Times entitled Foreign Affairs, The Key to All the Trouble in 1970. And listen carefully to what he said. He noted that the North Vietnamese had gained control of southeastern Laos in 1961, and he criticized the Kennedy administration for having accepted, quote, a de facto partition of the worst sort, leaving in communist hands the entire Ho Chi Minh Trail down which North Vietnamese warriors are still marching. The Kennedy administration's settlement was precisely what its adversaries wanted. So even Mr. Sulzberger in the New York Times is recognizing we agreed to this. We gave them this. In the meantime, bill after bill cutting off funds is going through Congress. It's gaining support every time. Lee Ducteau once said to Henry Kissinger, I don't know why I'm negotiating with you. I have just spent 6 hours with Senator McGovern. Your anti-war movement is going to give me what I want. Nixon in 1970 offered a standstill ceasefire. This was a huge concession because it was the first time our side said, you can leave your army in South Vietnam. We'll even agree to that. But even at that, the communists maintained total withdrawal, replacement of the GVN, and then you'll buy your prisoners back. From 69 to 72, 323,000 more North Vietnamese entered South Vietnam through Laos based on the tacit agreement that everyone kept operating under. You can come in and we'll host a guerrilla war. During that period, Nixon withdrew 386,000. The numbers are now all in their favor. We're way on the backside of the power curve. And after the 1972 Easter Offensive, the North Vietnamese now have over 100,000 men back in South Vietnam. They control huge swaths of territory, and now they're ready to negotiate. So on 10/8/1972, for the first time, they agreed to a ceasefire in place, a withdrawal of American troops, a return of American prisoners, and no requirement for us to replace the GVN. It's basically what Nixon had offered 2 years before. Now they've agreed to it. That was ultimately the deal that we cut. And interesting, we failed to keep our end of the bargain, not vis-a-vis the communists, but with regard to our ally. Over the next few years, Congress cut funds until Saigon was running on a shoestring, and the North Vietnamese simply knocked them off in 1975 because they were down to 13 bullets per day per man, and you can't fight a war with 13 bullets per day per man. So basically, the clock ran out. And think about it this way. This war ended with an agreement that Truman would never have entered into in Korea, and a Congress that would not support South Vietnam the way Congress still supports South Korea. This is why South Korea is still here and South Vietnam is not. And from the very beginning, we failed to secure South Vietnam very simply because the domestic political needs of the presidents who held office, which were defined by Ellsberg's rules, which came to us from Korea, both demanded the commitment and limited it in such a way that we would never begin to win. We never fought the Vietnam War as if it was a war. So the orthodox narrative we hear from is wrong on both counts. We were not led by good and able men of high integrity who made mistakes while acting for the country. They were acting for themselves the entire time, and it was winnable, at least plausibly, if we had treated it like a war, but we did not. It was, and if you want to call it unwinnable, it was unwinnable because of what our political class did, not because of a situation that we inevitably faced. And that's all I have. And if anybody has any questions, we can take some of those, I suppose.
All right. Hi, everybody. Jackie and I are going to be coming around with microphones. We just want to remind everybody that if you have a question, to please raise your hand, and please wait for a microphone before speaking so that our guests at home will be able to hear you.
First here. My question is, was Vietnam ever considered valuable to us as a listening post for what was going on in China? Did we ever look at it that way?
Not to my knowledge, no.
All right, next one's back here.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your address. But I would like to ask you, in your book, I have seen no advanced copies yet. Have you covered the Tonkin Gulf incident of 1964 and the duplicitous planning that got us into this mess where we never should have been? Does your book cover that, sir?
Yes.
All right, our next one over here.
Neal, thanks for waking us all up. Appreciate everything you said. My question is on. Any history on him after the war, where he ended up beyond being
Well,
a North Communist?
He ended up retired, and he tried to escape from Vietnam several times. And he once referred to it, if I remember correctly, he said he thought ultimately the result was very bad, and he said, all the bodies and all the blood for this, a broken down, bankrupt country run by a gang of cruel, paternalistic, half-educated theorists. That's what he called the people he'd served.
Wow, thank you.
Got another one?
I guess from your premise and the way you've introduced this in your fine presentation, that you disagree with every author, major author and historian, particularly those that say that we should have never been there. Gabriel Coco being one that says that we might have won if we were willing to destroy 80% of the population of Vietnam, and you disagree with that.
Yeah, well, Gabriel Coco is a Marxist. So he writes in that vein, and you've got to take a lot of what he says with a grain of salt. And no, we didn't have to kill 80% of the population. I don't necessarily believe we should have gone in there. Frankly, I don't even know that it was a good idea to go into Korea. I mean, look at what a mess North Korea is right now. And no matter how much people feel aggrieved by North Korea's maniacal behavior, we're very much responsible for that. It's very hard to believe we did what we did to that country for the reasons we did it. If you search this whole planet, you couldn't find a piece of territory with less strategic value to us than the Korean Peninsula, and yet we wiped out 20% of their pre-war civilian population in order to keep control of South Korea. And I can't find any reason for it other than Truman's electoral needs in 1950.
Over here.
A very excellent presentation, eye-opening. Does your book at all get into the little earlier period in Vietnam, the 1945 era, right at the end of World War II and so forth, when there was a minimal American presence in that part of Indochina, OSS people, and relatively friendly relations between those people and Ho Chi Minh?
Well, I discussed that a little as background, yes.
Okay. And at least some possibilities, of course, wiped out by political considerations.
Well, I don't know by the time they were asking for our support that we were ever going to give our support to any Marxist country. And Ho Chi Minh was a Comintern agent. He trained in Moscow. He was the founder of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, and he'd been a communist since the 1930s. So while he might have been a nationalist, he was certainly a communist, and I don't think there was any chance that any government in this country was ever going to support him. We ultimately kind of backed Tito in Yugoslavia, but we weren't responsible for putting him in power. We were willing to back him to irritate the Soviets, but we weren't about to put someone like him in power, and that's effectively what Ho Chi Minh wanted.
All right, got one more over here.
Hi, I have two questions. The first about An. Given the involvement of first the OSS and the CIA with Vietnam throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and the CIA's own involvement in intelligence, do you talk about why they would not have known that he was an agent, an active agent? Or did they, and for whatever reason, not reveal that?
No, to my knowledge, they didn't know. People were, even all the press people who were around him all the time, were absolutely stunned when they found out that he'd been working as a North Vietnamese agent all that time. And by the way, because he was contaminated from being around these Western reporters, they put him in a re-education camp for a while, okay? He had possibly been exposed to too much. I mean, those people are that demonic.
And the second part was that how do you add or connect Nixon's involvement in Cambodia with your overall structure about how the war was being lost after the non-partition, as it were?
Well, he actually went into Cambodia to try and kind of clean out some of their areas there, but it was way too little and way too late. He did the same thing in Lam Son 719. He sent the South Vietnamese army in. He didn't send in nearly enough troops. They were not a good enough army. Theoretically, if he really wanted to do something, he should have attempted when he first took office with 500,000 men in Vietnam to do that with American troops and effectively put CETO Plan 5 into effect. I don't think he felt that was politically possible. Maybe it would have been, maybe it would have been. We'll never know because he didn't try it.
We have another question here in the back.
Neal, thanks for a riveting speech, and it was eye-opening. I have another question about An, and this is another individual that I never even heard of until today, which is remarkable given that I lived through this war. My question is, what are 2 or 3 examples of pieces of disinformation that An was able to pass on through the Saigon Press Corps that were repeated in the media in the U.S. that allowed our leaders to continue and escalate the war successfully politically for so long?
Well, I can't give you any specific information he gave them that was disinformation. What you have to understand is the overall picture. The problem with An being in the middle of the press corps is that the entire orthodox narrative of our involvement in Vietnam it really begins with David Halberstam's book, The Best and Brightest. Everybody has written in that vein, and all those reporters in Saigon were sending dispatches with the same information. It's all Ziem's fault. He's incompetent, he's corrupt. Now the problem with that is, number one, it's all hopelessly compromised. As soon as Stanley Karnow tells you, well, An was explaining to us what was going on, because there's nothing they wanted more than the overthrow of Ziem. And secondly, if you look at his own history, as I noted, from 54 to 59, he was absolutely crackerjack. He got rid of all his opponents, he consolidated his rule, he destroyed the communists in the countryside, and yet he started having problems when what happened? The North Vietnamese army comes in, number one. Number two, we agree to let them come in and give them all the critical territory, and now he's being crushed, okay? He didn't make this situation, we did, all right? So for reporters in Saigon to endlessly talk about how incompetent and how this guy has to go and he's bad and he's stupid, when in fact they're under the control of an agent telling them all this, when it really isn't reflected in his own record of his own consolidation of power, gives you an idea of what he's telling them. But see, I'll never know, because you and I won't know exactly what An told Stanley Karnow in the Gavral. But if they're all reporting that Ziem is the problem, and yet until the North Vietnamese army started infiltrating as guerrillas, Ziem didn't have any problems at all, that gives you a pretty good idea of how inaccurate their reporting is. And why? Because the North Vietnamese want to get rid of Ziem. He was a national leader, and you will never replace him.
Wonderful. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Neal. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.